What if history's deadliest plagues came back? Not by chance, but because we let them. Since the late 18th century, humans have used vaccines to fight sickness. But today, that progress is slipping. Illnesses once thought consigned to the past are starting to return. So which killers are poised to strike first? And how bad could it get? Number 8. One of the most dangerous illnesses making a comeback is yellow fever. And all it takes is one bite from an infected mosquito. The disease remains prevalent across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, including Trinidad and Tobago. The name comes from one of its hallmark symptoms, a yellowish discoloration of the skin caused by infection. Victims may suffer fever, headaches, chills, loss of appetite, nausea, and severe muscle pain, often centered in the back. And this is what makes yellow fever so hard to detect in its early stages, especially without medical help. On top of that, the symptoms are usually short-lived, lasting around 5 days. But just because they fade doesn't mean the danger is over, because that is when yellow fever is ready to strike. In around 15% of the cases, yellow fever comes back with a vengeance, with not only the fever returning, but severe abdominal pain and even damage to the liver. And that's what causes the skin to rapidly turn yellow. It's a clear sign things are getting worse. At this point, there's an increased risk of internal bleeding and severe kidney complications. Fortunately, there's a safe and effective vaccine against yellow fever, and many countries often require international travelers to have been vaccinated before visiting. Just one dose is enough to protect someone for life, but without that shot, it's harder to prevent outbreaks of yellow fever. In Africa's hardest-hit regions, 124 cases of yellow fever were reported across 12 countries in 2024. That is despite the disease having declined dramatically over the past decade thanks to widespread vaccination campaigns. But at the start of this year, the tide began to turn again. The World Health Organization is already tracking 131 cases across 4 countries in the Americas. Efforts are being made to reduce the population of Aedes aegypti, the type of mosquito responsible for spreading the disease. But this alone won't stop the cases from happening. If infections can't be caught quickly, wider-scale immunization is the only way to prevent potential outbreaks. What is worse is yellow fever can't be treated by any specific measures. Once you have got it, all you can do is manage the symptoms. And for those that develop a severe form of the illness, roughly half of them will die. There might be ways to manage symptoms of yellow fever, though it can't be outright cured. But this next dangerous disease can have arguably worse symptoms, and it is nearly just as fatal. Number 7. Few diseases strike as fast as meningitis. It attacks the protective membranes around the brain and the spinal cord, known as the meninges. When these membranes swell, they press dangerously against the body's most vital organs, and that pressure can be deadly. While there's a viral form of meningitis, the bacterial kind is far more severe. It can trigger brain damage, seizures, paralysis, and strokes, and in the worst cases, it kills within hours. As if all that wasn't bad enough, experts aren't always even able to tell why meningitis happens. Sometimes patients can contract it thanks to a weakened immune system. Other times, a head injury can lead to an infection. While meningitis is the most common in infants under a year old, it can also strike college students living in dorms or other crowded settings. Adults with certain pre-existing health conditions or weakened immune systems are also at risk of developing bacterial meningitis. Throughout 2024, cases of meningitis rose significantly in Africa, and this has continued into 2025. Over the course of the first 3 months of the year, well over 5,000 cases have been reported in around 22 different countries, with nearly 300 deaths coming as a result of infection. That's already nearly a fifth of the roughly 26,000 cases reported in 2024, a year that also saw close to 1,400 deaths spread across 24 countries. The most virulent strain of meningitis is Haemophilus influenzae type B, better known as Hib. It causes meningitis in over half of infections, between 50 and 60%. In the United States, Hib was once the leading cause of meningitis in infants and children, responsible for around 20,000 invasive cases every year. About 2/3 of those developed into meningitis, while the rest led to other life-threatening illnesses like pneumonia, bloodstream infections, and even inflammation of the epiglottis, the cartilage that protects your voice box and throat. Before the Hib vaccine became available in December 1987, 1 in every 200 children under the age of 5 would develop some form of invasive Hib disease. Since the introduction of the conjugate Hib vaccine, incidents like these have decreased by around 98%. In fact, between 1994 and 1998, fewer than 10 fatal cases of invasive Hib disease were reported each year. While it was common and potentially life-ruining, if not fatal, most pediatricians now have never encountered a case of a Hib-related disease. While meningitis still occurs, Stopping immunization against one of its major bacterial causes would cause invasive Hib disease cases and deaths to spike dramatically. And meningitis is hardly the only harmful bacteria out there either. Number 6. Now this one's nasty. Diphtheria is caused by a bacterium, Corynebacterium diphtheriae, which produces poisonous toxins that can cause major heart and nerve problems. The fatality rate for diphtheria isn't as high as some other diseases on this list, typically ranging between 5 and 10%. However, it can climb as high as 20% among the young or very elderly if they become exposed to the bacterium. In most cases, symptoms of diphtheria often start out as just a sore throat and a fever. Nothing too serious, but the more severe infections can cause gray or white patches to form within the throat. These can actually get large enough to block a person's airway, causing rough, barking coughs. The facial lymph nodes also enlarge, resulting in swelling around the neck. Diphtheria can cause various other health complications, including myocarditis, inflammation of nerves, as well as kidney problems and bleeding due to low platelet levels. Back in the 1920s, diphtheria was one of the major causes of illness and death among children in the U.S. In 1921 alone, more than 206,000 cases of diphtheria were reported, with over 15,000 deaths. Thankfully, after a vaccine was developed in 1923, cases began to fall rapidly, dropping so low that by 2001, only 2 cases were reported across the entire country. While cases of diphtheria might be rare in the U.S., it is still a threat. The bacteria that causes it continues to circulate, being passed person to person. In 2003, an unvaccinated 63-year-old man who had traveled to Haiti died from clinical diphtheria, a reminder that many U.S. adults remain vulnerable. Screening for diphtheria has been carried out since 1977, and results show that nearly 30% of adults aged 60 to 69 lack protection. Their bodies don't have adequate levels of antitoxin needed to fight off the disease. With the help of international travel, cases of diphtheria are increasing in various parts of the world. Putting a stop to immunization programs could lead to a disaster, and we don't need to look too far at history to see that. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, public health systems in the newly independent states broke down, leaving much of the population without proper vaccinations. The result was a wave of diphtheria epidemics beginning in 1990. By the end of the decade, more than 150,000 cases were reported, and over 5,000 people had died. While it might not have had the same kind of mortality rate as meningitis or yellow fever, diphtheria is higher on this list than both because of one serious problem. Having a previous infection of the bacterium doesn't always prevent a person from reinfection. Only having the relevant antitoxin, which can be received through vaccination, is a surefire way to avoid this disease. Though if you thought the things diphtheria can do to the throat are bad, wait until you hear about Number 5. Tetanus is caused by bacteria found in animal waste, soil, and even street dust. And the worst part? There is not enough disinfectant in the world to wipe it out. Tetanus is highly resistant to most germ-killing cleaners, and its other name, lockjaw, gives a pretty big clue about the symptoms. It can cause the facial muscles to stiffen until the jaw locks shut. People who contract tetanus often experience spasms in their muscles, which can lead to their throat closing outright. This obviously makes breathing and eating difficult. The spasms can be so severe that it can even cause your bones to snap. The spine and other long bones are especially at risk of fractures. And in the worst cases, patients slip into a coma, with about 1 in 10 never making it out alive. In the United States, tetanus was a big problem between 1922 and 1926, with over roughly 1,300 cases each year. After the first targeted vaccine was introduced in 1938, public health officials began tracking tetanus more closely. 60 years later, by 2000, cases have dropped to just 41. But tetanus hasn't disappeared. It still poses a serious threat to unvaccinated children, especially newborns whose mothers were never immunized. In 1998 alone, tetanus killed 300,000 infants and around 30,000 women during childbirth. But in the last few years, tetanus is making a comeback in the U.S., particularly among those who use intravenous drugs like heroin. As commonplace as the bacteria that cause tetanus are, there's an even more common infection that we need to worry about. And that's number 4. More than 2 billion people worldwide have at some point in their lives been infected with hepatitis B. And to make it even worse, of that number, around 350 million will become carriers for the rest of their lives. While carriers can transmit Hep B to others, not all of them show symptoms. The danger is what comes later. Every year, over 1 million people die from liver disease and liver cancer caused by the virus. Hepatitis B is contracted from exposure to bodily fluids of someone carrying the virus. This can be blood, saliva, semen, even amniotic fluid. That's right, you can actually be born with Hep B. In the US alone, between 1,600 and 20,000 women carrying the virus give birth each year, passing the risk directly to their babies. Anyone taking immunosuppressant medication, especially drugs that stop the immune system from attacking healthy tissue, is at a higher risk of Hep B. The same is true for people living with HIV or those undergoing dialysis. Currently, around 1.25 million Americans have a long-lasting Hep B infection, and around 20% of them acquired it during childhood. Around 25% of children who are infected with lifelong Hep B are expected to die from liver disease as adults. And our next entry addresses arguably the most famous diseases affecting children. Number 3. Measles, mumps, and rubella are among the biggest threats to young children, and before you say we're cheating by cramming 3 diseases into one entry, there's a good reason for it. They can all be treated with the same single vaccine. Starting with the first of the 3, measles, you probably heard it described as a common childhood illness, and in the US, that's not entirely wrong. Before immunization, nearly every American child caught measles. At first glance, it might seem like little more than a rash, red spots that start on the face before spreading across the body. But just because almost everyone had measles doesn't mean everyone survived it. Between 1953 and 1964, there were around 450 measles-associated deaths every year. Even today, up to 20% of cases result in hospitalization, with around 17% leading to other health complications, including ear infections, diarrhea, and even pneumonia. Naturally, in those cases, measles can be life-threatening, with pneumonia accounting for most measles-related deaths. It can also trigger encephalitis, a swelling in the lining of the brain that can result in permanent brain damage. However, that is in rare cases. In the United States, the measles vaccine has reduced the number of infections by over 99%. But sadly, measles isn't a disease of the past. One of the largest outbreaks in recent history occurred back in 2019 when almost 1,300 people contracted the disease. The people most at risk of catching measles were the unvaccinated. Any population that isn't immunized against measles can spread the disease rapidly. If vaccinations stop, then well over 2.5 million measles-related deaths could occur annually, each one being preventable. Let's talk mumps next. This is another disease that, despite most people being vaccinated against, can and does still have outbreaks. Like several others on this list, mumps outbreaks often flare up when large groups of people suddenly start living in close quarters, like college dorms. And that's exactly what happened in 2006, when an outbreak swept through campuses infecting 5,800 students across 15 states. While symptoms can include headaches, tiredness, and fever, the main one is severe pain and swelling in the jaws and cheeks. For those born with them, mumps can even cause a painful swelling of the testicles. Though it's normally a more mild viral disease, there are rarer and far more severe conditions that can occur from a mumps infection. Before vaccination, mumps was the leading cause of childhood deafness. But hearing loss wasn't the only danger. Serious complications included swelling of the brain, nerves, and spinal cord, which could trigger paralysis, seizures, and even fluid buildup on the brain. And these more serious side effects are more common in adults than children. If a woman contracts mumps during the first trimester of pregnancy, it can lead to a miscarriage, which leads us to the third disease in the trio. Completing the trifecta is rubella, also sometimes called the German measles. Much like mumps, rubella can have really severe consequences if someone carrying a child ends up infected with it. Infants that contract rubella from a parent will develop congenital rubella syndrome, also called CRS, which can result in heart defects, cataracts, and deafness. Before routine immunization, a rubella epidemic swept the U.S. between 1964 and 1965. It left 20,000 infants born with CRS, caused more than 11,000 miscarriages, and 2,100 neonatal deaths. Of those infants, over 3,500 were blind, and about 1,800 had intellectual disabilities. But thanks to widespread vaccination, the story looks very different today. Since 1999, only about 40 pregnant women in the U.S. have been infected with rubella. And for most countries, that vaccine is MMR, a 2-dose shot taken early in childhood to allow for infants and young children to develop immunity. Without it, rubella would likely resurge and threaten more pregnancies. Mumps would also spread more easily since it's so highly transmissible. And measles cases would increase, except they already have. Myths, misinformation, and disrupted immunization programs have driven down measles vaccination rates across America, especially among school-age children. As recent as August of 2025, there have been just shy of 1,400 confirmed cases of measles across 41 states. That is the most cases since the year 2000. At one school in Texas, an outbreak of measles hospitalized 99 people and killed 2 unvaccinated children. Measles is a highly preventable disease. If 95% of people in a community are vaccinated, then that community is protected, including the 5% who don't get MMR. And it's not the only potential fatal disease that could be making a concerning comeback either. Number 2. Polio and smallpox were 2 of the biggest threats to global public health. But while the 2 are often linked, only one still lingers. Smallpox is one of the rare diseases completely eradicated by global vaccination campaigns. Polio, however, persists, still spreading at endemic levels in countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan. The polio virus causes acute paralysis, and historically, it left thousands of children crippled, some forced to walk in braces or on crutches, and many unable to walk at all. Those who survived polio with permanent disabilities were considered the lucky ones. Others were left unable to breathe without the help of iron lungs, and many more never survived at all. Prior to the development of the polio vaccine, the United States saw between 13,000 and 20,000 cases of paralytic polio reported each year. In April 1988, the World Health Assembly launched a mission to wipe out polio across the globe. Thanks to vaccination, the virus was eliminated from the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and the Western Pacific. But the work is not quite finished yet. In 1988, there were around 350,000 cases of polio reported across 125 countries. By 2006, there were only 2,017 countries, and only Afghanistan, India, Nigeria, and Pakistan remain endemic. But stopping vaccination before full eradication would all but guarantee a resurgence, leaving millions vulnerable to the paralytic virus. And somehow, polio might not even be the most extreme disease trying to make a return. That top spot goes to number 1. While it's rare, plague, or the Black Death, isn't gone. The plague comes in 3 distinct forms, each one affecting a different area of the body, and it has its own symptoms. Pneumonic plague affects the lungs, often causing a shortness of breath, coughing, and chest pains. Septicemic plague infects the blood, causing bodily tissues to undergo necrosis, a form of cell injury that results in cells literally dying. And thirdly, there is the bubonic plague, which attacks the lymph nodes and causes swelling. It's accompanied with flu-like symptoms including headaches, fever, and vomiting. This can also trigger necrosis, where the skin around the site where the Yersinia pestis entered the body begins to darken and die. Occasionally, the lymph nodes of someone with bubonic plague might swell up so much that they form buboes, which can painfully break open. As you're probably aware, there's already been one major pandemic of bubonic plague taking place in medieval Europe between 1346 and 1353. Centuries later, the Black Death is still one of the most fatal pandemics in recorded history. It caused the deaths of between 25 to 50 million people, around half of the entire population of Europe at the time. Pneumonic plague spreads through the air in infectious droplets, while bubonic plague and septicemic plague are usually transmitted through flea bites, or by handling animals carrying infected fleas or the plague itself. That's why you probably heard the Black Death was spread by plague rats whose fleas arrived in Europe on trading ships. But the rats weren't the only culprits. Squirrels, mice, and other rodents can also carry the plague-infected fleas, making them just as dangerous. Bubonic plague is the most common form of the plague, with around 600 cases reported each year. Back in 2017, countries with the highest number of cases were the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, and Peru. But that doesn't mean that the cases still don't occasionally spring up elsewhere. In the United States, plague infections still surface in rural regions. The disease is believed to circulate among rodent populations, particularly in the western states. While modern antibiotics can take care of the plague, it can still be life-threatening if it isn't caught early enough and treated. Without treatment, the risk of death is as high as 90%. With antibiotics or preventative medication, it's only 10%. Normally, vaccination against the plague is only recommended if someone is thought to be at a greater risk of contracting it, but that could very soon be a lot more of us. In August of 2025, New Mexico reported its very first human case of bubonic plague when a 43-year-old man was hospitalized with the disease, and it's thought that he was likely exposed to fleas carrying the plague bacteria while camping in an area where plague is known to circulate amongst the wildlife. And that wasn't the only incident where a person contracted the plague in 2025. In July, a man from Arizona contracted the disease and actually died from it. Health officials warn people to avoid sick rodents, use insecticides to keep the fleas out of their homes, and treat pets regularly to prevent infection. But if cases begin to rise and the United States were to stop vaccinations entirely, how long before we face an unwanted sequel to the Black Death? If deadly diseases can come back when we stop vaccinating, parasites are an even nastier threat. Watch Most Painful Parasites That Infect Humans to find out why these tiny invaders are pure agony, or click on this video instead.